This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The night the Esposito Empire nearly ended, the Long Island Sound was black as poured ink, and the rain came down like something with a grudge. Giovanni Esposito had walked into the meeting at the old Corvallo shipping yard the way he walked into every room, like he already owned it. 3 men behind him, 2 ahead, a briefcase of nothing but blank paper, because the real money never travelled with him anymore. Not since he'd learned the hard way that trust was a currency that devalued the moment you spent it. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than most men's cars, and beneath it, a Kevlar vest he hadn't needed in 4 years. He needed it that night. The deal was supposed to be simple. A handshake with the Russo family to divide the docks, an uneasy peace after 18 months of Cold War. Giovanni didn't trust Vincent Russo. He didn't trust anyone who smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. But peace was profitable, and profit was the only religion Giovanni had left. He should have known when Dante didn't answer his phone. Dante Moretti, his cousin, his underboss, the man who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral with his hand on Giovanni's shoulder and sworn blood-deep loyalty. Dante was supposed to be watching the east perimeter. Instead, the east perimeter opened up like a door. The first shot took out Marco, his driver, dropping him mid-sentence with a joke still on his lips. The second and third came from the water, from a boat Giovanni hadn't been told about, and after that there was no counting, only the roar of it, muzzle flashes strobing white against the rain, men he'd trusted for years, suddenly strangers with guns. "Boss, go! Go!" someone screamed, and hands shoved him toward the black water because the alternative was a bullet. And Giovanni Esposito had spent his whole life choosing the lesser of 2 deaths. He went into the Sound in his $3,000 coat, and the cold hit him like a second ambush, stealing the air from his lungs before the current could steal anything else. Something tore through his side. He felt it before he heard it, a white-hot punch below his ribs, and the water around him bloomed warm for one strange floating second before the cold swallowed that too. He didn't remember deciding to swim. His body simply refused to stop, some animal stubbornness older than thought, dragging him through the waves while gunfire cracked distantly behind him, while the boat's engine screamed as it circled, hunting. He went under once, twice, came up coughing brine and copper. The shore was a rumour, a darker line against dark sky, and he swam for it because it was the only thing left to want. The last thing Giovanni Esposito was aware of before the black closed over him for good was the absurd, distant thought that he was going to die exactly the way he'd lived. Alone, bleeding, and betrayed by someone who had once called him family. Amara Vale heard the storm before she saw it, the way she heard everything now, early and alone. 2 years of living in the cottage at the edge of Windmere Point had taught her the moods of that shoreline better than she'd ever known the moods of another person. She knew when the tide would drag driftwood up past the dune grass. She knew the particular hush before a nor'easter, the way the gulls went silent and the light turned the colour of a bruise. She hadn't meant to build a life this small. Once she'd had a classroom full of 8-year-olds who called her Miss Amara and fought over who got to hold her hand at recess. Once she'd had a husband who sang off-key in the shower, and a daughter with her father's stubborn chin. and a house in Providence with a mortgage and a mudroom always full of small, muddy shoes. That life had ended on a rain-slicked highway 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago, and Amara had not so much recovered from it as relocated around the wound, the way a tree grows around a fence post driven through its trunk. She'd sold the house. She'd stopped answering her sister's calls for a while. She'd bought this cottage with the insurance money because it was remote and grey and asked nothing of her. And for 2 years, that had been enough. She was standing at her kitchen window at 11 that night, watching the storm throw itself against the black glass, when the lightning showed her something on the beach that made her blood go still. A shape. Human-shaped. Face down in the tide line, the surf dragging at it with each retreating wave, as if the sea hadn't decided yet whether to keep him. Amara didn't remember making the decision to run outside. She only remembered the rain hitting her like open hands, the sand sucking at her bare feet, and the terrible, familiar lurch of her heart when she reached him and rolled him over and saw the blood soaking black through his shirt and the grey, drowned pallor of his face, and, absurdly, even through the fear, how beautiful he was, even like this, even half dead. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat, a pulse, faint, furious, alive. "Don't you dare," she said to a stranger she had never met, her voice swallowed by the wind, her hands already moving to drag him higher up the sand, out of the water's reach. "Don't you dare die on me too." He was heavier than any man had a right to be, and Amara was not strong in any way that mattered for this. She was 31 years old, 5'5", and had not lifted anything heavier than a bag of mulch in over a year. But adrenaline made liars of muscles, and somehow she got him across the sand on an old wool blanket, hauling with both hands wrapped in the fabric, cursing and sobbing and praying in no particular order, until she reached the low dune and the porch steps, and finally, the kitchen floor. She should have called an ambulance. She knew that, some small, rational corner of her mind kept insisting on it, even as her hands worked. But Windermere Point was 40 minutes from the nearest hospital on a good night, and this was not a good night. Downed lines, flooded roads, the kind of storm that swallowed calls for help and spat back nothing. She tried anyway. 3 bars became 1, became none. The landline was dead, killed by a fallen branch somewhere down the county road, as it had been dead twice already that winter. It was just her and a dying stranger bleeding out on her kitchen tile. "Okay," she whispered, and something in her, something that had been asleep for 2 years, 4 months and 11 days, woke up and took over. She had been a teacher, not a nurse, but grief had made her resourceful in strange ways. She'd spent a year of her life researching trauma care obsessively, in the desperate, useless hope that if she'd only known more, she could have saved the people she'd lost. That knowledge had sat in her like a stone. Tonight, it became a tool. She cut his shirt away with kitchen shears. The wound below his ribs was through and through, thank God, a bullet that had passed clean instead of lodging somewhere she couldn't reach. She knew that much at least, knew that an exit wound meant she wasn't going to be digging metal out of a man's body with a paring knife in her kitchen. But it was bleeding badly, and there was a second wound, shallower, along his shoulder, and bruising already darkening across half his ribs, like something had hit him besides bullets. "You're not allowed to die in my kitchen," she told him, packing gauze, real gauze, from the well-stocked first aid kit she kept for exactly the kind of isolation she'd chosen, against the wound and pressing down with both hands, her whole weight behind it. "Do you hear me? I didn't invite you." He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But his chest rose, fell, rose again, ragged and shallow, and she counted each breath like a rosary. It took 40 minutes to get the bleeding to something like manageable, another 20 to get him out of his ruined, freezing clothes and into blankets on the floor because she could not lift him onto the bed. Another hour before his skin lost the terrible bluish cast and warmed under her hands to something like human temperature again. By 2 in the morning, she sat back on her heels, hands shaking, shirt soaked through with rain and blood, and looked, really looked, at the man she'd pulled out of the sea. He was, she thought, with a kind of dazed, exhausted clarity, absurdly handsome, even wrecked like this. Dark hair gone black and heavy with salt water, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Even unconscious, even grey with blood loss, his face held an expression that wasn't quite peace, more like a man braced for a blow even in sleep, brows drawn faintly together, mouth set in a hard line that softened only slightly as his breathing evened. There were no ID, no wallet, nothing in the pockets of the clothes she'd cut away except a phone, waterlogged and dead, and a gun. A gun. She stared at it a long moment, sitting there on her kitchen table where she'd set it, black and heavy and utterly wrong, in a house that until 3 hours ago had contained nothing more dangerous than a paring knife and old grief. Amara Vale was not a stupid woman. She understood, distantly, that a man who washed ashore, shot and bleeding, carrying a firearm and no identification, was not a man who'd had a boating accident. Whatever he was, whatever he'd run from, it had wanted him dead badly enough to put 2 bullets in him and leave him in the sea. She should have been afraid. Some part of her was. But a larger part of her, the part that had spent 2 years being furious at a universe that had taken everything from her without asking, the part that had stopped believing she had any purpose left except to keep breathing, looked at this stranger's ruined, beautiful face and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could stand to count. She felt necessary. "Fine," she said quietly, to the storm, to the dark, to whatever God had decided to test her tonight. "Fine. You want to die? You'll have to do it somewhere else. Not here. Not on my watch." She got a pillow under his head, banked the fire higher, and settled in beside him on the floor to wait out what remained of the night. One hand resting, she told herself it was to monitor his pulse, against his uninjured shoulder, as if her touch alone might be enough to keep a stranger tethered to the world. He woke, like a man surfacing from deep water for the second time that night, except this time the water was fever, not sea. For 3 days, Giovanni drifted between waking and something worse than sleep, a hot, formless dark, shot through with fragments, gunfire, rain, Dante's face turned away from him at the perimeter, the particular betrayal of watching a man he'd trusted his whole life choose not to look him in the eye. He surfaced sometimes to cool hands on his forehead, a soft voice telling him to drink, broth on his tongue, and once, in the depths of the worst of the fever, A woman's face, close to his, dark-eyed and unfamiliar, saying his name, except it wasn't his name, because he hadn't given her one. On the fourth morning, he woke fully, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Giovanni Esposito did not know where he was. The ceiling above him was wood, low, hand-hewn beams. A wood stove ticked and glowed somewhere to his left. He was in a bed, an actual bed, soft and smelling of clean cotton and faintly lavender. And someone had dressed his wounds with a competence that surprised him, gauze changed and taped with careful precision. He was shirtless, bandaged, alive against every reasonable expectation. And he was, notably, unarmed. His hand went instinctively to his hip, found nothing, and something in him went cold and sharp, despite the lingering fever weakness in his limbs. "It's on the table, if you're looking for it." He turned his head, too fast, the room tilting, and found her in the doorway, a mug in each hand, watching him with an expression that was equal parts wary and unreadable. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back messily, and the kind of face that would have been called plain by people who'd never really looked at it, except Giovanni looked, the way he looked at everything, cataloguing threat and opportunity in the same breath, and found instead something that derailed the calculation entirely. Tired eyes, a steadiness to her that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having already survived the worst thing that could happen to her. "Where am I?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It came out flat, an assessment disguised as speech, the voice he used on men who owed him money. "Windermere Point." She set one mug on the nightstand, didn't come closer. "You washed up on my beach 4 nights ago, with 2 bullets in you and no ID. I'm the reason you're not dead. You're welcome, by the way." He absorbed that in silence, running through the possibilities the way he'd run through every dangerous room he'd ever entered. No badge, no wire he could see, no second set of footsteps in the house. A woman living alone at the edge of nowhere, who had, for reasons he couldn't yet pass, chosen to save a stranger's life instead of calling the authorities, or, more sensibly, letting the tide take him back out. "What did you tell people?" he said. "Nothing. There's no one to tell. Phone lines have been down since the storm, and even when they're up, I don't exactly have anyone checking in." She said it without self-pity, a simple fact laid down like a card on the table. "I didn't call anyone about you, because by the time the roads cleared, you weren't dying anymore. And I figured a man who washes up shot and carrying a gun probably has reasons he doesn't want a hospital asking questions." Smart. Dangerously smart for a stranger. "You should have called someone anyway," he said. "Probably." She met his eyes, and there wasn't fear in hers, which unsettled him more than fear would have. "You want to tell me who's looking for you? Because someone will be. Men like you don't just fall off boats." Giovanni Esposito had built an empire on never giving anyone information they could use against him. It was instinct as much as strategy. Closed hand, closed mouth, closed door. But he was flat on his back in a stranger's bed, unarmed, half-healed, and entirely, unfamiliarly, at her mercy. And something about that fact made the old instinct feel suddenly, uselessly small. "John," he said. "My name's John." It wasn't even a good lie. He watched her clock that, watched the faint, knowing tilt of her mouth that told him she didn't believe it for a second, and yet she only nodded and held out the second mug. "Well, John, drink this before it goes cold. You've got a fever that won't quit and a hole in your side, and I'd rather you not die of stubbornness after I worked this hard to keep you breathing." He took the mug. Their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, and something in his chest, some organ he'd thought had gone permanently to scar tissue years ago, gave one hard, unfamiliar knock. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in a decade. "Don't thank me yet." She turned for the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at him, dark eyes assessing in a way that felt uncomfortably close to seeing straight through his lie. "You're not out of the woods. And John, whatever you did to earn those bullets, I don't want to know. I've got enough ghosts of my own." She left him alone with the fire and the ache in his side, and the strange, dislocated feeling of being, for the first time in 15 years, a man with no name that meant anything at all. Power, Giovanni had learned young, was a language spoken in silence, in the way rooms rearranged themselves around him, in how men lowered their eyes, in the particular quiet that fell over a restaurant when he walked in. He had not been an ordinary man since he was 19 years old, and his father had put a gun in his hand and told him love was a luxury for people who didn't have empires to protect. He had forgotten what it felt like to be simply looked at. Amara looked at him, not through him, not around the shape of his reputation, not with the careful deference of men calculating how his mood might affect their next month's earnings. She looked at him the way she might look at any wounded, difficult creature that had washed up needing help, with a kind of clear-eyed, unimpressed patience that he found against every instinct he owned, unbearably disarming. "You're a terrible patient," she told him on the 6th day, when he'd tried to stand on his own and nearly put his face through the wood stove for the trouble, catching himself on the mantel with a hissed curse in Italian that he hadn't meant to let slip. She'd been across the room in 3 steps, one arm braced under his good shoulder before he could wave her off, steadying him with a strength that surprised him every time, given how slight she was. "I've had worse," he said, teeth gritted. "I believe you. That's not the point. The point is you're going to tear your stitches being stubborn, and then I'm going to have to redo them, and I only have so much thread." She got him back into the chair by the fire with brisk efficiency, no fuss, no fear. And Giovanni found himself watching her the way he might watch an opponent across a negotiating table, except there was nothing to negotiate here, nothing she wanted from him, and that fact alone made her the most confusing person he'd encountered in years. He learned the shape of his days at Windmere Point the way he'd once learned the shape of empires, by observation, by patience, by cataloguing every small detail until the pattern revealed itself. Amara woke before dawn, made coffee too strong for most people's taste, and drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the light change over the water. She kept the house scrupulously ordered, in a way that felt less like tidiness and more like control. Like a woman who had learned that when everything else in her life had spun apart, the least she could do was keep her dishes stacked and her floors swept. She didn't own a television. She had shelves of books that looked read rather than displayed, spines cracked, pages softened with handling. She talked to her garden, which was dead this time of year, in a low, unself-conscious murmur he pretended not to notice. And she never, not once in 6 days, asked him a single question he didn't want to answer. That, more than anything, unravelled something in him. "You don't want to know who's hunting me," he said one evening, the fire between them, rain ticking soft against the windows, an ordinary storm this time, nothing like the one that had nearly killed him. Most people would want to know. Most people are curious about danger because they think it can't reach them. Amara didn't look up from the sock she was darning. An old habit, she'd told him earlier, one her grandmother had taught her. One of the small, useless, comforting rituals she'd kept from a life she rarely spoke of. "I know better. Danger doesn't care whether you're curious about it or not. Knowing your secrets wouldn't make me safer. It'd just make me part of them." "You already are part of them," he said quietly. "The moment you pulled me out of that water." Her hands stilled on the sock. For a moment, something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of weary acknowledgement, as if she'd already made peace with a risk most people would have run from. "Maybe. But I've survived worse than a stranger's trouble, John. I think I can survive this, too." He wanted, badly, and for the first time in years, to tell her the truth. Not because honesty had ever served him. In his world, the truth was a weapon you kept sheathed until it could do maximum damage, but because something about lying to this particular woman in this particular firelit room felt like a betrayal of the only genuine kindness anyone had shown him without expecting something in return. He didn't tell her. Not yet. He told himself it was to protect her, that the less she knew, the safer she'd be when the men hunting him inevitably found his trail. He told himself the lie was a mercy. He didn't examine, not yet, the other, quieter reason. That he was afraid if she knew who he really was, she would stop looking at him the way she was looking at him now. Like a man, not a monster, not an empire, just a man, broken and healing, worth the trouble of saving. For 6 days, Giovanni Esposito had been nobody, and it was, unbearably, the first time in his adult life he had felt anything close to peace. She told him about Daniel and Lily on the 9th night, and she never quite understood, afterward, why she chose that particular hour to open the door she'd kept locked for 2 years. Maybe it was the brandy, 1 glass, medicinal, prescribed by her own stubborn insistence that he needed something for the pain, now that the fever had broken and the wound was closing clean. Maybe it was the way he'd asked, not with the prying curiosity most people used, poking at grief like it was a wound they wanted to see the size of, but with a quiet, steady attention that made silence feel like an option rather than an obligation. "You wear a wedding ring," he'd said, nodding at the thin gold band she still wore on her right hand, having long ago moved it from the left. "But you live alone." She could have deflected. She'd gotten good at deflecting. In 2 years, a whole practiced repertoire of "I don't really talk about that," and "long story," and "the flat," closing look that told people to stop asking. Instead, for reasons she didn't examine too closely, she found herself saying, "His name was Daniel. We were married for 6 years. Giovanni didn't say anything. He just watched her, dark eyes steady in the firelight, and something about the quality of his silence, unhurried, unafraid of what she might say next, loosened something in her chest that had been clenched tight for so long she'd forgotten it could open. "We had a daughter, Lily. She was 4. Amara turned the ring on her finger. An old habit, worn smooth by 2 years of the same nervous motion. There was a drunk driver on I-95 3 years ago this April. Crossed the median doing 80. Daniel was driving. Lily was in her car seat in the back, singing along to the radio. She used to sing along to everything, even songs she didn't know the words to. She'd just make up her own. Her voice didn't break. She trained it not to, the way you train a muscle. I was supposed to be in the car. I had a meeting run late at school. If I'd left on time, I would have been in the passenger seat and maybe— "Don't," Giovanni said, low. "Don't what?" "Don't finish that sentence. I've watched men tear themselves apart with maybe for years. It never once brought anyone back. It only ever cost the person still standing." His voice had an edge to it that surprised her, not impatience, but something that sounded almost like recognition, like a man speaking from a wound of his own. "You didn't kill them. The man who crossed the median did." "I know that." She did know it, intellectually, the way she knew 100 other true things that her heart had simply refused to file alongside the facts. Knowing it doesn't make the house quieter. He was quiet for a long moment, firelight moving over the hard planes of his face, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him yet, not the careful, controlled cadence he used for everything else, but something closer to raw. "I know what it is to lose people who were supposed to be permanent," he said. "My mother died when I was 12, my father when I was 30. And more recently—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and she watched him visibly decide not to finish that thought, the way she so often stopped herself. "The world doesn't get quieter. You just learn to live inside the noise." "Is that what you've done? Learned to live inside it?" "I don't know anymore." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel suddenly and acutely visible after 2 years of choosing invisibility. "Before I came here, I would have said yes. I'd built a whole life around not needing anyone to look at me the way you're looking at me right now." "How am I looking at you?" "Like I'm a person," he said. "Not a problem, not a use, just a person." Amara didn't have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say out loud, so instead she reached over and refilled his glass and let the fire fill the silence between them, and told herself the sudden warmth low in her chest was only the brandy, only the late hour, only 2 lonely people trading grief like currency because they had nothing else worth spending. She almost believed it. Almost. In New York, the Esposito family was quietly, viciously coming apart. Salvatore Bianchi had not slept in 4 days. He'd been Giovanni's driver's cousin once, decades ago, before he'd earned his way up through the ranks by being the one man in the organization who never lied, never skimmed, and never once flinched when a job needed doing. Now he was the closest thing Giovanni had to a second-in-command who wasn't also the man Sal privately suspected of orchestrating the ambush that had taken his boss. "There's no body," Sal said, for the 5th time that week, to the assembled captains in the war room of the Esposito compound in Oyster Bay, a room with bulletproof windows and a view of the water that had once seemed like an amenity and now felt like a taunt. "No body means he's not confirmed dead. Until I see a body, I run this family like Giovanni's walking back through that door tomorrow." Dante Moretti sat at the head of the table, Giovanni's chair, though no one had said so out loud yet, though everyone in the room had noticed exactly whose seat he'd taken, and steepled his fingers with the patient, sorrowful expression of a man performing grief for an audience. "Sal, it's been 10 days. The Coast Guard called off the search a week ago. Men don't survive 2 gunshot wounds and the Long Island Sound in November. Dante's voice was gentle, reasonable, the voice of a man who had spent 38 years perfecting the art of sounding like the only sane person in the room. I loved my cousin. God knows I did. But someone has to hold this family together while we grieve, and I don't see anyone else stepping up. Convenient, Sal said, that you're so ready to step up. The room went very still. Dante's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker, quick and cold, gone before anyone but Sal could have caught it. Careful, Salvatore. Grief makes men say things they regret. I'm not grieving, Sal said. I'm counting. 3 men dead that night besides Giovanni. 2 of them were on your East Perimeter detail. You want to tell this table again how the Russo boat got past a perimeter you were personally responsible for staffing? I want to tell this table, Dante said, standing now, his voice climbing just enough to carry the weight of command, that we buried 3 good men. We lost our boss, and instead of uniting to find out who did this and make them pay, Salvatore Bianchi wants to turn his grief into an accusation against family. That's not loyalty, Sal. That's paranoia. It was a good performance. Sal had to give him that. Dante had always been better at rooms than Giovanni, better at reading which way a crowd wanted to lean, and leaning with it a half-second before anyone noticed he'd moved. But Sal had known Giovanni since they were boys running numbers on Mulberry Street, had watched him build an empire out of ruthlessness and precision, and Sal knew, with the bone-deep certainty of 30 years' loyalty, that Giovanni Esposito did not die easily, and did not die without leaving evidence of exactly who'd tried to kill him. I'm not accusing anyone, Sal said, sitting back, letting his voice go flat and unreadable, the mask he'd worn through 100 negotiations. I'm saying we don't declare a king dead until we've got a body. Until then, this family stays exactly as it is. No transitions, no new arrangements with Russo, no changes to territory. We wait. Dante's jaw tightened, just barely. And if he doesn't turn up? Then we'll bury him properly, and this conversation can happen again. Until then, Sal stood, buttoning his jacket, meeting Dante's eyes across the long table with a look that promised he would be watching every move Dante made from this moment forward. Until then, his chair stays empty. He left the meeting with 3 of his most trusted men and a decision already made. He was going to find out what really happened at Corvallo shipyard, starting with the boat that had come from nowhere, the boat no one on the Esposito side had ordered, the boat that meant someone inside the family had opened a door for the Russos to walk through. And 200 miles north, along a grey, wind-scoured stretch of Maine coastline that no map would have connected to a shipyard ambush in Long Island, Giovanni Esposito sat by a stranger's fire, healing under a false name, entirely unaware that the empire he'd built was already beginning to bend beneath the traitor's hand, and entirely unaware that the man hunting hardest to bring him home was also, without meaning to, drawing a line straight toward the one place Giovanni most wanted to keep hidden. By the 3rd week, Giovanni could walk the length of the beach without his side pulling, though he still favoured it, still moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned, the hard way, exactly where his body's limits were now drawn. He'd started helping around the cottage, small things at first, chopping kindling one-handed, until Amara caught him and threatened to hide the axe. Then, once she'd relented, actual useful labour. Fixing the hinge on the shed door that had been sticking since before she'd bought the place, patching a leak in the porch roof with a competence that surprised her. "Where'd a man like you learn to fix a roof?" she asked one afternoon, watching him from the yard as he balanced on a ladder with more grace than a man 3 weeks out from 2 gunshot wounds had any right to possess. "I wasn't born with money," he said, which was true. In the specific and careful way, he'd learned to tell truths that revealed nothing. "My father built things before he built anything else. I learned to use my hands before I learned to use anything more complicated." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth. His father had built an empire out of the docks and the unions and a willingness to do violence that had made the Esposito name feared from the Bronx to Bay Ridge, and the things Giovanni had learned to build with his hands in later years had rarely been roofs. But watching Amara's face soften at the answer, watching her decide to believe the smaller, kinder version of him he'd offered her, Giovanni felt something twist in his chest that he recognized, with mounting unease, as guilt. He was not a man who felt guilt easily. Guilt required believing you'd done something wrong, and Giovanni had spent 2 decades convincing himself that the things he did were necessary, that violence in defense of family was simply the tax that power demanded. But lying to Amara, watching her patch him back together with unearned tenderness, watching her tell him about her dead husband and daughter with a trust she extended to almost no one, felt different from every other lie he'd told in his life. It felt like theft. That evening they sat on the porch steps together, watching the sun bleed orange and pink across the water, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that Giovanni was intensely, physically aware of every inch of space between them. "You're leaving soon," Amara said. It wasn't a question. "Once you're strong enough, you'll go back to whatever life you had before you washed up here. Do you want me to?" The question surprised them both. It came out rougher than he'd intended, edged with something he hadn't given himself permission to feel yet. Amara turned to look at him, dark eyes catching the last of the light, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "I don't know what I want," she said finally, honest in a way that cost her something. He could see it in the tightness around her eyes. "I built this whole life around not wanting anything. Not wanting people, not wanting connection, because wanting things means you can lose them, and I already know exactly how much that costs." She looked away, back toward the water. "And then you washed up on my beach, and for 3 weeks I've had a reason to make 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1. And I don't know what to do with how much that terrifies me." Giovanni reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and covered her hand with his. Her skin was cold from the evening air. His was rougher than it had once been, healing scars where healthy flesh had been. "I terrify myself too," he admitted, and it was, he realized with a kind of vertigo, the truest thing he'd said to anyone in 15 years. "I've spent my whole life making sure nothing could reach me, making sure I never needed anyone enough, that losing them could break me. And you—" He stopped, throat tight, unused to this particular kind of exposure. "You've undone that in 3 weeks without even trying." That's not exactly a comforting thing to hear from a man who won't tell me his real name, she said. But there was no real edge in it, only a soft, sad honesty that made his chest ache. "No," he agreed. "It's not. I'm sorry." She didn't ask him to explain. She only turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together, and they sat like that as the light failed. Two people who had each spent years building walls, specifically designed to keep the world out. Watching those walls come down, one quiet, terrifying inch at a time. Neither of them moved to kiss the other. It wasn't time yet. They both seemed to understand that, some instinct older than words. But the air between them had changed, charged now with a current that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago. And when Amara finally rose to go inside, she paused at the door and looked back at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Equal parts hope and terror. A woman standing at the edge of wanting something again. "Good night, John," she said. "That's not my name," he said quietly, the words out before he could stop them. She went still in the doorway. "I know." "Giovanni," he said. "My name is Giovanni." It was only a first name. It was, he told himself, a small mercy, a partial truth offered like a down payment on the whole one he still couldn't bring himself to give. But watching her mouth shape the syllables silently, testing them, watching something in her eyes soften further at the gift of it, Giovanni understood that he had just taken the first real step off the cliff he'd been standing on for 3 weeks, and that there would be no climbing back up once he jumped the rest of the way down. That night, Giovanni dreamed of the shipyard, the way he had every night since the water first took him. Except this time, the dream gave him something new. Dante's face, turned toward the boat that shouldn't have been there, not surprised, not afraid, expectant. He woke in the dark, heart slamming, the phantom ache of the bullet wound flaring hot beneath his ribs, and lay very still until his breathing slowed, until the cottage resolved back into safety around him, the wood stove's dying glow, the sound of Amara's steady breathing through the wall. He'd known on some buried level since the moment the shooting started. He'd simply refused to let himself look at it directly, the way you refuse to look directly at the sun, even when you already know it will blind you. Dante had grown up in his shadow, not literally poorer, the Morettis had never wanted for money, but poorer in the currency that mattered most in their world. Respect, inheritance, the birthright of the name that opened doors. Giovanni's father had been the Don. Dante's father had been the consigliere, brilliant and indispensable, and permanently, structurally second. Dante had inherited that positioning like a birth defect, and Giovanni, in the 20 years since he'd taken his father's chair, had never once thought to ask whether his cousin had made peace with playing second forever. He thought of 100 small moments now, replayed through the clarifying lens of betrayal. Dante's quiet objections to Giovanni's peace overtures with the Russo family, always framed as caution, never as what Giovanni now suspected they truly were. A man laying groundwork for an alliance of his own. Dante's insistence on personally staffing the east perimeter that night, a detail Giovanni had accepted without question because questioning Dante had simply never occurred to him. Family didn't get questioned. Family was the one variable in Giovanni's calculations he had never once run the numbers on. That he understood now, staring into the dark of a stranger's guest room 200 miles from everything he'd built, had been his single greatest weakness. He had spent 2 decades guarding against every enemy who might come at him from outside the family, and it had never once occurred to him that the knife could come from inside it. He thought, too, unbidden, of his mother, dead now nearly 30 years, a woman his father had loved with a ferocity that had terrified Giovanni as a boy. Watching his father, a man capable of ordering violence without blinking, dissolve into something soft and helpless whenever his wife walked into a room. Giovanni had asked him once, maybe 10 years old, why he let anyone matter that much when mattering made you weak. "It doesn't make you weak," his father had said. "It makes you have something worth being strong for. There's a difference, Giovanni. Someday you'll understand it." He hadn't understood it. Not for 30 years. Not through a childhood of watching his father's power and his mother's early death teach him that love was simply the shape grief took before it arrived. Not through 2 decades of building an empire specifically designed to never again let anyone matter enough to be a vulnerability. He understood it now, lying in the dark of Amara Vale's guest room, listening to her breathe on the other side of a thin wall, with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like a door finally swinging open on a room he'd kept locked his whole adult life. He loved her. It had happened somewhere in 3 weeks of fever and firelight, and her hands stitching his skin back together with a gentleness no one had shown him since his mother died. And he had not seen it coming, had not built any defense against it at all, because he had never once imagined he would need one against a woman who lived alone at the edge of the world and asked for nothing in return for saving his life. It terrified him more than Dante's betrayal, more than the bullets, more than anything he'd faced in 20 years of running an empire built on fear. Because now, for the first time since he was 12 years old and watched his mother's coffin lowered into frozen ground, Giovanni Esposito had something to lose that mattered more than power, more than pride, more than his own life. And somewhere in New York, a traitor who had already tried to kill him once was sitting in his chair, consolidating power, and would not hesitate, Giovanni knew with total certainty, to use anything and anyone he loved as leverage the moment he discovered it existed. He had to leave. He had to leave before Dante found out Amara existed at all. The thought of it, of walking away from the only peace he'd known in 15 years, of leaving her exactly the way the world had already left her once, alone, at the edge of a life she'd built out of the wreckage of loss, was, Giovanni realized with a kind of bitter, helpless clarity, the first decision in his adult life he did not know if he had the strength to make. Sal Bianchi found the boat 11 days into his investigation, rotting in a private slip registered to a shell company that traced back through 4 layers of paperwork designed to prevent exactly this kind of tracing, to a man who did occasional favours for the Russo family. It wasn't proof. Not the kind that would hold up in the kind of court that mattered in their world, where verdicts were delivered by men with guns rather than juries. But it was enough for Sal, who had not survived 30 years in the Esposito organization by needing courtroom-grade proof for anything. He sat with the information for 2 days before he acted on it, turning it over the way Giovanni had taught him to turn over any piece of intelligence before moving, looking not just at what it proved, but at who benefited from him believing it. If the boat belonged to a Russo cutout, that meant one of 2 things. Either Vincent Russo had ordered the hit himself, betraying a peace deal he'd shaken hands on days earlier, or someone had used the Russo connection to make an inside job look like an outside one. Sal had spent his whole career distrusting the second, more elegant kind of lie, because the men who told it were always smarter than the men who told the first kind. He made a call he should have made 2 weeks earlier, to a contact in the Coast Guard's regional office, an old debt from a favour Giovanni had done years back, quietly cashed in now for information rather than money. The search for Giovanni Esposito had been called off after 6 days, officially. Unofficially, a fishing charter captain out of a small harbour 200 miles north had reported in passing to a Coast Guard buddy 3 weeks back a strange thing. A woman living alone at Windermere Point had bought triple her usual groceries at the general store the week after a bad November storm, along with bandages, antiseptic, and enough gauze to field dress a small war. It was nothing. It was gossip, small-town noticing, the kind of detail that meant absolutely nothing on its own. It was also, Sal knew, exactly the kind of detail a man who trusted nothing and no one learned to pay attention to. He drove north himself rather than sending someone, because after 11 days of watching Dante consolidate power inside the organization with the smooth, patient efficiency of a man who had been planning this for years, Sal did not trust a single other person in the Esposito family with the possibility that Giovanni might be alive. If word got back to Dante before Sal could confirm it, before he could get Giovanni somewhere safe and gather the proof he needed to expose the betrayal, Giovanni would be dead before Sal ever laid eyes on him again. And this time, there would be no ambiguous boat wreckage left behind to investigate. Just a body, disposed of properly, and a new Don sitting comfortably in a chair that had never truly belonged to him. Windermere Point, when Sal finally found it on a map 3 days later, was less a town than a scattering of houses along a wind-scoured peninsula, the kind of place people went to disappear. He drove the coast road slowly, memorizing the layout, cataloguing sight lines and access points with the automatic professionalism of a man who had spent his career thinking in terms of ambush and defence. He found the cottage at Windermere Point's northern edge, isolated, backed against dune grass and grey water, smoke rising thin and steady from its chimney. And through the kitchen window, in the fading afternoon light, Sal Bianchi saw a sight that stopped his breath in his chest. Giovanni Esposito, alive, thinner than he'd been, moving with the careful stiffness of a healing wound, standing at a stove beside a dark-haired woman, laughing, actually laughing, an unguarded sound Sal hadn't heard from his boss in over a decade, at something she'd said. Sal sat in his car at the end of the gravel drive for a long time before he worked up the nerve to knock, torn between relief so total it nearly undid him, and a colder, more practical dread. Whatever peace Giovanni had found in that cottage, whatever this woman meant to him, Sal was about to be the one to shatter it, dragging his boss back into a war that would not stay contained in New York much longer, and dragging her, whoever she was, straight into its path along with him. The knock at the door came just as the light was failing. 3 sharp raps that made Giovanni's whole body go still in a way Amara had never seen before. Not the careful stiffness of a healing wound, but something older and more animal. A predator's readiness dropping over him like a second skin. "Stay behind me," he said. Voice dropped into a register she didn't recognize, already moving toward the door, with none of the careful economy he'd used all month, moving instead like a man remembering all at once exactly how to be dangerous. "John, what—" "Giovanni," he corrected, distracted, and then, at her look of pure confusion, "There's no time. Whoever's at that door, stay back until I know." But when he opened the door, the tension went out of him in a rush. She felt more than saw. His shoulders dropping, one hand coming up to scrub across his face in an expression of pure, exhausted relief. The man on the porch was broad-shouldered, grey at the temples, dressed like he'd driven a long way without stopping, and the two men looked at each other for a long moment before the stranger pulled Giovanni into a rough, fierce embrace that spoke of years neither of them needed to explain in words. "You're alive," the man said, voice cracking. "Christ, Gio, we thought... Everyone thinks you're dead. I've spent 3 weeks holding that family together with nothing but stubbornness, and I need you to come home before Dante finishes stealing it out from under both of us." Gio. Dante. Amara stood frozen in her own kitchen, watching two strangers speak in the shorthand of a shared history that had nothing to do with the small, quiet life she and this man, Giovanni, she made herself think, the name he'd finally given her only nights ago, had built together in these 3 weeks. Watching the stranger's eyes flick to her, assessing, cataloguing her presence with the same automatic wariness she'd have expected from a man used to reading rooms for threats. "Who's this?" the man said, not unkindly, but with an edge of caution that made her feel suddenly uncomfortably exposed. "This is Amara," Giovanni said. "She's the reason I'm alive, Sal. She pulled me out of the water and put me back together with her own hands, and she asked me for nothing in return, not even my real name, until 3 nights ago." He turned to look at her then, and something in his face, guilt, she realized, cold recognition sliding through her chest, told her, before either man said another word, that the life she'd nursed back to health at her kitchen table was about to reveal itself as something far larger and far more dangerous than she'd let herself imagine. "Amara," Giovanni said, and his voice had gone careful now, the voice of a man choosing each word like it might detonate. "There's something I have to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago." "Your name isn't John," she said, flat, already several steps ahead of him, the pieces she'd refused to look at directly for 3 weeks now, arranging themselves with terrible clarity. "It's Giovanni." "And this man just called you Gio like he's known you his whole life, and he said something about a family and about someone stealing it from under you and—" She stopped, throat tight, staring at the gun she'd seen him check, without thinking, the moment the knock came, the same gun she'd found on her kitchen table 3 weeks ago and locked away in a drawer, without asking a single question she'd been too afraid to hear the answer to. "Who are you?" "My name is Giovanni Esposito," he said, and watched her face for the recognition he clearly expected, and found it, a fraction of a second later, when the name landed somewhere in her memory with the weight of tabloid headlines and half-remembered news segments about organized crime in New York. I ran, before 3 weeks ago, one of the largest crime families on the East Coast. The men who shot me and left me for dead were sent by my own cousin, who is currently sitting in my chair. And Sal drove 200 miles to tell me my empire is being stolen out from under me, while I've been here, learning what it feels like to be an ordinary man for the first time in my adult life. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the June grass with a sound like held breath. "You're a Mafia boss," Amara said, very carefully, as though testing whether the words would hold weight if she said them slowly enough. "Yes." "You lied to me for 3 weeks." "Yes," he said again, and this time his voice cracked slightly. The first crack she'd heard in it since the night she'd found him bleeding in the surf. I lied because I was afraid that if you knew, you'd look at me the way everyone else does. Like a threat. Like an opportunity. Like a man to be managed instead of a man to be cared for. You're the only person who's looked at me like I was simply human in 15 years, Amara. And I was selfish enough to want to keep that for a little longer before the truth ruined it. She stood very still, hands braced against the counter behind her, feeling the floor of her carefully rebuilt life tilt beneath her feet, and did not know, in that first raw moment, whether what she felt was betrayal, or fear, or something far more dangerous. The terrible, undeniable fact that even now, even with the truth laid bare between them like a wound, she still did not want him to leave. Sal had the tact to excuse himself to the porch, muttering something about checking the perimeter that both of them understood to be a kindness, leaving Giovanni and Amara alone in the kitchen with the wreckage of a truth neither of them had been ready for. "Say something," Giovanni said, when the silence had stretched past what he could bear. "What do you want me to say?" Amara's voice was low, controlled in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have. That it's fine? That I understand why a man let me fall in love with a lie for 3 weeks because the truth was inconvenient? She caught herself on the word love. He saw it happen, saw her flinch at her own honesty, and something in his chest tightened painfully at the admission she clearly hadn't meant to make. "I never lied about who I was with you," he said. "Not really. Everything I told you, about my mother, about learning to work with my hands, about what it felt like to have nothing left to lose and then finding you, all of that was true. The only lie was my name, and even that I gave you 3 days before Sal walked through that door. You run a crime family, Giovanni." She said the name like a verdict. "People die because of decisions you make. That's not a small omission. That's not a white lie about your job title." "No," he agreed. "It's not. And I won't insult you by pretending it is, or by pretending I'm a good man wearing a bad man's title. I've done things in 20 years of holding that family together that would make you sick if I described them to you. I've ordered violence. I've built an empire on fear, because fear was the only currency that kept my people alive in a world that wanted us dead." He crossed the kitchen slowly, giving her every chance to step back, to tell him to stop. And when she didn't, he stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see her pulse jumping at her throat. "But I have never, not once in 20 years, lied to protect myself at someone else's expense the way I lied to you. I lied because for 3 weeks I got to be a man instead of a title, and I was too much of a coward to risk losing that by telling you the truth. That's not a defense. It's not meant to be. It's an apology, badly delivered by a man who's never had much practice at apologizing for anything." He reached up, slowly, and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and felt her breath catch, even as her eyes stayed hard, unyielding. "I'm not asking you to forgive the lie tonight. I'm asking you to believe that everything else was real. That the man who sat by your fire and listened to you talk about Daniel and Lily, who fixed your porch roof and learned the sound of your voice well enough to know when you're tired before you say a word, That man is real, Amara. He's the only version of myself I've liked in 15 years. She was crying now, silently, the tears tracking down her face with a stubborn, furious quality that told him she hated herself for them. "I promised myself I wouldn't do this again," she said. "I promised myself, after Daniel and Lily, that I wouldn't let anyone matter enough to destroy me a second time if I lost them. And you," her voice broke, "you're not just a man who might leave Giovanni. You're a man other people are actively trying to kill. Someone already shot you twice and left you in the ocean. What happens the next time? What happens when it's not the water that finds you first?" "I don't know," he admitted, and it cost him something to say it. A man who'd spent his whole life projecting certainty, even when he had none. "I don't have an answer that makes this safe, because it isn't safe. Loving me was never going to be safe, Amara, and I won't lie to you about that the way I lied about my name." "So what do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the truth. I don't want anything from you. I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who want something: loyalty, protection, a piece of the territory, a favor cashed in at the right moment. You're the first person in my adult life who's ever given me something and asked for nothing back. I'm not here to ask you for anything now either." He stepped back, putting distance between them that clearly cost him, jaw tight with the effort of it. "I have to go back. Tonight, tomorrow, as soon as I'm strong enough to travel. There's a man sitting in my chair who tried to kill me once, and will try again the moment he learns I'm alive. And I won't bring that danger into this house a second longer than I have to. That's not me choosing my empire over you. That's me trying, for once in my life, to protect something instead of just taking it." Amara wiped her face with the back of her hand, her gesture so raw and unguarded it undid something in his chest. "And if I asked you to stay?" "Then I'd have to tell you no," he said quietly, "and it would be the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than anything I did the night I nearly died. Because staying means Dante wins, and everyone who's loyal to me pays the price for my cowardice. But leaving without knowing whether there's anything here worth coming back to," he shook his head, "that might be harder still." He left 3 days later, once Sal had confirmed the roads, and Giovanni's strength had returned enough that Sal stopped looking at him like he might collapse walking to the car. Those 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, neither of them quite able to return to the easy warmth of the weeks before, neither of them willing to let the anger of that first night calcify into something permanent. Amara found herself watching him with a new, aching awareness, not just of the man she'd nursed back to health, but of everything that man was walking back toward. Violence, danger, a war she could not follow him into, even if some reckless, terrified part of her wanted to. Sal kept a careful, respectful distance, sleeping in his car the first night, before Amara, exasperated, insisted he take the guest room, muttering something about not wanting a grown man's stiff neck on her conscience, along with everything else. She caught him watching her sometimes, with an assessing, careful curiosity, and understood, without being told, that he was trying to decide whether she was a liability or an asset to the man he'd clearly have died for without hesitation. "He hasn't laughed like that in years," Sal told her on the second night, finding her alone on the porch while Giovanni slept. "Not since before his father died." I've known Giovanni Esposito since he was 19 years old, and I've never once seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "That's not exactly reassuring, given who's looking," Amara said, but there was no real bite in it. "No," Sal agreed. "It's terrifying, if I'm honest. Loving a man like Giovanni means loving a target. But I've watched a lot of powerful men in my life, and most of them never let anyone see them without the armor on. 3 weeks with you, and he's better than I've seen him in a decade. That has to count for something." The morning he left, the sky was the flat, colourless grey of early winter, the wind carrying the first bite of the cold that would soon lock the coast down entirely. Giovanni stood in her kitchen, in clothes Sal had brought him, a dark coat, expensive, nothing like the ruined charcoal one the sea had taken, looking for the first time since she'd pulled him out of the water, exactly like the man his reputation described, composed, controlled, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. It should have frightened her. Instead, it only made her chest ache harder, watching the armor settle back over him piece by piece, understanding that the man who'd fixed her porch roof and listened to her grief without flinching was still in there, buried now beneath the weight of everything he was walking back toward. "I don't know how long it'll take," he said, "to deal with Dante, to make sure this is safe again. I know. I don't want to promise you something I can't guarantee. I've learned that much, at least, from lying to you about my name." He reached for her hands, and she let him take them, cold fingers wrapping around cold fingers in the drafty kitchen. "But I'm going to come back for you, Amara. Not because you need saving. God knows you've proven you don't need anyone to save you. But because for 3 weeks you gave me a version of my life I didn't know I was allowed to want. I'm not walking away from that because it's inconvenient. I'm walking away because staying would get you killed, and I would rather lose you to distance than lose you to Dante Moretti's men." "And if you don't come back?" The question cost her everything to ask. Old grief and new fear tangled together in her chest until she could barely breathe around them. "Then you'll know I died trying," he said. "And that will have to be enough, because I can't give you certainty. No one in my world gets certainty. But I can give you this." He kissed her then, finally. 3 weeks of careful distance, collapsing into something fierce and desperate and entirely unguarded, his hands framing her face like she was something infinitely precious. And Amara kissed him back with everything she'd spent 2 years telling herself she'd never feel again. Grief and fear and hope tangled together into something that tasted impossibly like the beginning of a life she hadn't let herself want. When he finally pulled back, both of them breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers and murmured, "I love you. I don't have any right to say that after 3 weeks and 1 lie, but I need you to know it before I go." "I love you too," Amara said, and watched something in his face break open at the words, raw and unguarded in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. "Come back to me, Giovanni. I mean it. Whatever it costs. Come back." He left 20 minutes later, Sal's car pulling away down the gravel drive and disappearing around the bend toward the coast road, and Amara stood on her porch in the flat grey winter light for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded, one hand pressed to her mouth, feeling the shape of a decision she hadn't known she was making until it had already happened. She was not going to wait quietly at Windermere Point for news of whether he lived or died. She was going to find a way into his world, whatever it cost her, because she had already buried one love without a fight, and she was not going to bury a second one from 200 miles away, wondering forever if there'd been something she could have done. The return to Oyster Bay felt to Giovanni like stepping back into a life that no longer fit the way it once had, a suit tailored for a man he wasn't entirely sure he still was. Sal had arranged everything with the discretion of a man who'd spent 30 years managing crises. A private return under cover of night, no announcement, no warning to the wider organization, just a handful of Giovanni's most trusted men gathered in the war room to see with their own eyes that their boss was alive. The reactions were, to Giovanni's practiced eye, immediately and usefully informative. Relief, real and unguarded, from the men who'd served his father before him. Careful, calculating recalibration from the newer captains who'd grown comfortable under Dante's 3 weeks of stewardship. And absence, conspicuous, telling absence, from 3 men who should have been in that room and weren't. Men, Sal quietly informed him, had grown notably close to Dante in recent weeks. "He doesn't know yet," Sal said, once the room had cleared, leaving just the 2 of them and the low hum of the building's security systems. "I kept it tight. Only the men in that room know you're alive, and I trust every one of them with my own life." "Good." Giovanni stood at the window, looking out over the dark water, thinking of a different coastline 200 miles north, a different kind of quiet than the dangerous, watchful silence of this room. "I want to know everything Dante's done in 3 weeks, every meeting, every deal, every man he's moved into position. I want to understand exactly how far this goes before I decide how to end it." It went further than he'd expected. Over the following days, working through Sal's careful intelligence with the cold, methodical focus he'd once brought to every problem in his life, Giovanni watched the shape of his cousin's betrayal reveal itself in full. A quiet alliance with Vincent Russo, forged months before the ambush, promises of shared territory in exchange for help removing Giovanni from the board entirely. A plan not merely to seize power, but to reshape the entire balance of the East Coast underworld, with Dante and Russo splitting what had once been Esposito territory between them. The betrayal itself didn't surprise him anymore. He'd made his peace with that particular grief the first night he understood it, alone in Amara's guest room, with the truth finally admitted. What surprised him, and unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, even to Sal, was how little the prospect of reclaiming his empire moved him now. He'd spent 20 years believing that power was the only thing worth protecting, the only inheritance worth the cost of everything else it demanded. 3 weeks at Windermere Point had shown him something he couldn't unsee. A version of himself that had nothing to do with territory or fear or the careful architecture of respect he'd built his whole identity around. A version of himself that existed simply because a woman had chosen to save a stranger's life and ask nothing in return. He wanted that version of himself back. He wanted it more than he wanted his chair, more than he wanted vengeance against Dante, more, if he was entirely honest with himself in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come, than he wanted the empire at all. But wanting it and being able to have it were different things. And Giovanni understood, with the same cold clarity that had built his empire in the first place, that there was no path back to Amara that didn't run directly through ending Dante's betrayal first. A man who left a war half-finished didn't get to walk away and build a quiet life at the edge of the world. He only invited the war to follow him there. "There's something else," Sal said, 3 days into the intelligence gathering, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Giovanni on alert. One of Dante's men was seen making inquiries about a woman living alone on the Maine coast. Small town, general store gossip, nothing confirmed, but it matches the location close enough that I don't think it's coincidence. Giovanni's whole body went cold. How long ago? 2 days? Maybe 3? Giovanni was already moving toward the door before Sal finished the sentence. Every careful, patient calculation about timing and strategy and proper procedure collapsing under a single, overwhelming imperative that had nothing to do with empire or vengeance, and everything to do with the terrible possibility that his 3 weeks of cowardly happiness at Windmere Point had already gotten the only person he'd ever unguardedly loved marked for death. Amara knew something was wrong 3 days after Giovanni left, when the man who came to fix her water heater wasn't the same man who'd fixed it the previous winter, and asked too many questions about how long she'd lived alone and whether she often had visitors, and left without ever actually looking at the water heater at all. She'd spent those 3 days in a strange, suspended state of her own, researching in careful, deniable increments on the library computer in the nearest town, since she didn't trust her own internet connection, exactly who Giovanni Esposito was. The articles were sparse, careful, the kind of coverage that suggested a man who'd spent considerable resources keeping his name out of print. A business empire with interests in shipping and construction that federal investigators had spent a decade trying and failing to connect definitively to organized crime. A reputation, in the small, whispered corners of the internet where such things were discussed, for ruthless efficiency and, more surprisingly, for a kind of old-world code of honor that made him respected even among men who feared him. None of it prepared her for the man with the wrong questions standing in her kitchen, or for the cold animal instinct that told her, the moment his truck disappeared down the coast road, that she needed to leave the house immediately. She grabbed her keys, her phone, the small overnight bag she'd packed and hidden in the hall closet 3 days earlier in a fit of practical paranoia she'd almost been embarrassed by at the time, and was halfway to her car when a second vehicle turned into her drive. Not the water heater man's truck, but a black SUV she didn't recognize, moving too fast for a gravel road, moving like men who'd already decided how this was going to go. Amara did not scream. She would think about that later, in the aftermath, with a kind of distant surprise at her own composure, that some part of her, forged in the specific crucible of losing everything once already, simply refused to fall apart when the moment demanded otherwise. Instead, she ran, cutting behind the house toward the dune path she'd walked 100 times, toward the rocky outcropping 1/2 mile down the shoreline where the tide pools made the footing too uncertain for a vehicle to follow. 2 men came after her on foot. She heard them shouting to each other, heard the specific, terrible clarity of a gun being racked somewhere behind her, and ran harder than she'd run in her entire life. Sand and marsh grass tearing at her legs, lungs burning, the old grief-numbed part of her mind screaming that this was how it happened. This was how the universe took everything a second time. While a newer, fiercer part of her, the part that had spent 3 weeks nursing a stranger back from the brink of death with her own 2 hands, refused, absolutely refused, to make this easy for them. She made it to the rocks with 100 yards of lead, scrambling up onto the outcropping, where the footing turned treacherous, where a man moving fast in city shoes would find himself slowed by exactly the kind of terrain Amara had spent 2 years learning by heart. She ducked behind a boulder, chest heaving, blood roaring in her ears, and heard the men's voices grow closer. Heard one of them radio something into a phone she couldn't make out over the wind and the surf. "She's not worth the trouble if she's not with him," one voice called, closer than she'd like, carrying strangely on the wind. "Moretti just wants confirmation she exists. We grab her, we call it in, we let him decide what leverage is worth." Leverage. The word landed in her chest like a physical blow, understanding crystallizing with terrible speed. This wasn't random. This was Dante Moretti, reaching 200 miles north to turn her into a weapon against the man she loved. Exactly the danger Giovanni had tried, in his own clumsy, guilty way, to warn her about before he left. She was still processing that thought, still calculating whether she could make it further down the rocks before they found her hiding place, when a third vehicle came screaming down the coast road behind them, and this time, when Amara risked a glance over the boulder, what she saw made her breath catch in her throat with a hope so sharp it was almost pain. Giovanni Esposito was out of the car before it had fully stopped, moving across her yard with a controlled, murderous speed that had nothing left in it of the careful, healing man who'd fixed her porch roof 3 weeks earlier, and everything in it of exactly the man his reputation had always promised he could be. Giovanni had not slept in the 2 days it took him to confirm the threat and organize the drive north, running on adrenaline and a cold, focused fury he hadn't felt since the night of the ambush itself. He'd left 3 of his most trusted men to hold the compound and secure Sal's continued investigation into Dante's remaining allies, and had driven north himself rather than send anyone else, because some decisions, Giovanni had learned in 3 weeks at Windmere Point, could not be delegated. Not when the stakes were a woman who had asked him for nothing and given him everything. The 2 men Dante had sent were competent, but they were city men, comfortable with concrete and enclosed spaces, and Giovanni had grown up spending summers on his family's boat off Montauk, had learned tidal terrain and rocky shoreline the way he'd later learned boardrooms and back alleys. He came around the outcropping from the waterside, moving low and fast across ground he'd only walked once, but had memorized with the same obsessive attention he brought to everything that mattered, and had the advantage of surprise fully in hand by the time the first man turned to face him. The confrontation that followed was brief, brutal, and entirely without the theatrical drama such moments were often given in the stories men like him inspired. Giovanni disarmed the first man before he'd fully registered the danger, a controlled, economical violence born of muscle memory rather than rage, and had his gun trained on the second before the man could finish raising his own. "Tell Dante," Giovanni said, voice low and utterly without mercy, "that I'm alive. I know exactly what he did, and if he sends one more man within 100 miles of this woman, I will personally make sure he understands the difference between the man he tried to kill and the man he's about to face." The men fled, scrambling back toward their SUV with the particular speed of professionals who understood, suddenly and completely, that they'd badly misjudged the situation. Giovanni let them go. Killing them here, on Amara's beach, in view of her home, was not a mercy he was willing to extend to himself, whatever satisfaction it might have offered, and turned instead toward the outcropping where he'd glimpsed a flash of movement behind the rocks. Amara. She emerged slowly, still catching her breath, sand and salt spray in her hair, eyes wide with an adrenaline shock that hadn't yet fully processed into safety, and Giovanni closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that had nothing left in it of careful restraint. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair, holding her so tightly he could feel her heart hammering against his own chest. "I am so sorry. I should never have left you exposed. I should have brought you with me. I should have—" "You came," she said, muffled against his shoulder, her hands fisted in his coat like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "You actually came." "I will always come," he said, pulling back just enough to look at her face, cupping her jaw in both hands. "Do you understand that now? Whatever this costs, whatever it means for the rest of my life, I am never letting you face something like this alone again." "They said Dante wanted confirmation I exist," Amara said, the shock beginning to give way to something colder, more furious. "That he wanted to use me as leverage." "I know." Giovanni's jaw tightened, the murderous focus from moments earlier returning to his eyes. "And that means he's desperate, Amara. A man secure in his power doesn't reach 200 miles to grab civilians as leverage. He's losing ground inside the organization, and he knows it. And he's willing to do something this reckless because he's out of better options." He took her hand, already moving them both toward the house, toward safety and the practical business of what came next. "But it also means I can't leave you here anymore. Not at Windmere Point, not anywhere he could reach again. This has to end, and it has to end soon, and I need you somewhere I can actually protect you while it does." "So what happens now?" Giovanni was quiet for a moment, looking back at the tide line where the SUV's tracks still marked the sand, at the ocean that had once nearly killed him and had instead, impossibly, delivered him into the one life he hadn't known he wanted. "Now," he said, "I go back to New York, and I finish what my cousin started, and you're coming with me, if you'll have me. Not as a hostage to my world, not as leverage for anyone to use against me, but because I am done pretending I can keep you safe by keeping you separate from who I really am." That was always a lie I was telling myself, not you. Amara looked at him for a long moment, the wind off the water pulling at her hair, and then, with a steadiness that took his breath away, she nodded. "Then let's go finish it," she said. "Together this time. No more lies, no more separate. I already lost one family to a world I couldn't control, Giovanni. I'm not going to lose you to one I could have stood beside you in." The Esposito penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building overlooking Central Park, all glass and dark marble, and the kind of understated luxury that announced power precisely by refusing to shout about it. And Amara felt, the moment she stepped off the private elevator, entirely and irrevocably out of her depth. "You don't have to pretend this feels normal," Giovanni said, watching her take in the space, the wall of windows, the original artwork she suspected cost more than her cottage, the quiet, watchful presence of 2 guards positioned at the elevator with the particular stillness of men trained to be furniture until the moment they weren't. "It doesn't feel normal to me either, most days. I just stopped noticing a long time ago." I noticed everything at Windmere Point too, she said. The difference is, I chose the smallness. This feels like it chose you. It did, he admitted. That's the part I need you to understand, before we go any further. I didn't choose this life the way you chose your solitude. I was born into it, the way you're born into a family, a religion, a set of expectations you don't get to opt out of without opting out of everything and everyone you love along with it. I've spent 20 years telling myself that made the violence acceptable. That inheritance excuses obligation. I don't fully believe that anymore. But I also don't know how to be anyone else. Not entirely. Not after this long. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that had become, in the weeks since Windmere Point, as natural as breathing. I'm not asking you to be someone else. I fell in love with the man who fixed my porch roof and told me the truth about my grief when I couldn't tell it to myself. If that man exists somewhere inside all of this, she gestured at the penthouse, the guards, the whole glittering, dangerous architecture of his world, then I can learn to live alongside the rest of it. Sal found them there an hour later, with news that changed the calculus entirely. Dante, having learned through channels neither of them could yet trace, that Giovanni had not only survived, but was actively back in the city, had called an emergency meeting of the family's ruling council for that same night, ostensibly to confirm rumours of Giovanni's survival, but transparently, to Sal's read, an attempt to seize full, formal control before Giovanni could rally enough support to reclaim it. He's desperate, Sal said, echoing what Giovanni had already told Amara on the beach. Desperate men make mistakes. This is our chance to make him make one in front of witnesses who matter. I want to be there, Amara said, before either man could suggest otherwise. Both of them turned to look at her, with near identical expressions of alarm. Absolutely not, Giovanni said. That room will have every dangerous man in the organization in it, plus Dante, plus God knows what he's planned. It is not a place for... For what? For someone he already tried to use as leverage? Amara held his gaze, steady in a way that reminded him exactly why he'd fallen for her in the first place. He already knows I exist, Giovanni. Hiding me away doesn't make me safer anymore. It just makes me easier to find alone, the way his men nearly did 3 days ago. If I'm in that room, surrounded by your men, in your sight, that's the safest I've been since this started. Giovanni looked at Sal, who gave a slow, reluctant nod, and then back at Amara, something fierce and proud and terrified warring behind his eyes. You are the single most stubborn woman I have ever met, he said. You love that about me? God help me. I do. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead, breathing her in like a man memorizing something he refused to lose again. Stay close to Sal. Do exactly what he tells you, exactly when he tells you. Tonight, we end this, one way or another. The war room at Oyster Bay was full by the time Giovanni arrived. Every captain and made man of consequence gathered around the long table beneath the bulletproof windows. And the collective intake of breath when he walked through the door, alive, composed, flanked by Sal and 3 of his most loyal men, was, Giovanni thought with grim satisfaction, worth every mile of the drive north and back. Dante's face, for just a fraction of a second before he mastered it, showed something Giovanni had waited weeks to see. Pure, unguarded fear. Gilles. Dante recovered fast, rising from the chair at the head of the table. Giovanni's chair, with an expression already rearranging itself into relief, into the practiced performance of a loving cousin overjoyed by a miracle. Thank God. We heard rumours, but I didn't dare believe. Sit down, Dante. Giovanni's voice cut through the room like a blade, and the older man's forward motion stuttered, faltered, stopped. You don't have to perform for this table anymore. I know about the Russo alliance. I know about the boat. I know you personally staffed a perimeter that let it through. And I know you've spent 3 weeks moving men and money to consolidate a power grab you started planning long before that shipyard meeting ever happened. The room had gone utterly silent. Every man at that table doing the rapid, silent calculation Giovanni had spent his whole life teaching them to do. Recalculating loyalty, recalculating risk, watching to see which way the balance of power was about to tip before committing themselves to either side of it. That's a serious accusation, Dante said, voice tight now, the performance cracking at its seams. Do you have proof, or are you just, I have the boat's registration, traced through 4 shell companies to a man who does favours for Vincent Russo? Sal stepped forward, laying a folder on the table with the calm, methodical precision of 30 years' loyalty finally allowed to bear its full weight. I have phone records placing you in contact with Russo's people 6 times in the 2 months before the ambush. I have testimony from 2 men on your East Perimeter detail who are prepared to explain, in whatever detail this council requires, exactly what instructions you gave them that night. Dante's eyes moved around the table, searching for allies, and found instead the particular, terrible silence of men who had already begun quietly repositioning themselves the moment the folder hit the wood. You'd believe him over family, Dante said, desperation bleeding into his voice now, all pretense gone. After everything I've done for this organization, you tried to have me killed, Giovanni said, and something in his voice, low and absolutely without mercy, silenced whatever Dante had been about to say next. You put 2 bullets in me and left me for the sea to finish the job. And then you sat in my chair for 3 weeks while I was fighting for my life 200 miles from here, and you had the audacity to send men after the woman who saved that life, to use her as leverage against me. He let that land, watched several men at the table flinch, the use of civilians against family being, even in a world built on violence, a line most of them still respected. That's not a difference of opinion, Dante. That's a declaration of war against your own blood. And this family does not forgive that kind of betrayal. You know that. You've watched me enforce that exact rule against other men. Dante's hand moved, fast, toward the inside of his jacket, and Giovanni was already moving, already had his own weapon drawn, before Dante's fingers closed around anything. But it was Sal, faster still, who put himself bodily between the table and his boss, gun already levelled, voice absolutely steady. Don't, Sal said. Don't give him a reason, Dante. You've done enough damage tonight. The standoff held for 3 long, terrible seconds, the whole room frozen, weapons half drawn, 30 years of family bonds fraying to nothing in real time, before Dante's hand fell away from his jacket. Empty, and something broke visibly behind his eyes. Not remorse, Giovanni understood, watching his cousin's face collapse into something bitter and small, but simple, exhausted defeat. You were always going to win, Dante said quietly. Even now, even like this. No, Giovanni said. I was always going to survive. Winning would have meant you never tried this at all. He gave the order without hesitation, without the guilt he might once have expected to feel, watching Sal's men move in to secure his cousin. Not for execution, not tonight, not in this room, but for the long, careful reckoning that family betrayal demanded, a fate Giovanni suspected, watching the fight go finally and completely out of Dante's shoulders, might prove far worse than a quick death would have been. Across the room, Amara stood beside two of Giovanni's most trusted guards, watching the man she loved end a war with the same cold precision he'd once used to describe fixing a roof, and understood, with a clarity that settled something deep and unshakable in her chest, that she had not fallen in love with a monster wearing a good man's face. She had fallen in love with a man capable of being both, and had chosen, with open eyes, to stand beside all of him. The weeks that followed unfolded with the strange, disorienting quiet that always follows violence, paperwork instead of gunfire, quiet consolidations of loyalty instead of open war, the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust in an organization that had watched its own blood turn traitor. Giovanni changed things, in ways both large and small, that surprised the men who'd served his father before him. He brought in independent oversight on his territory's legitimate businesses, quietly began shifting resources toward the construction and shipping interests that had always been the family's public face, and, more surprisingly still, spent less time at the Oyster Bay compound and more time in a smaller, quieter apartment he'd bought without telling anyone. One with a view of open water, because he found, in the months after Windermere Point, that he could no longer sleep in rooms that didn't face the sea. "You're different," Sal told him one evening, watching Giovanni move through the paperwork of the Rousseau negotiations, a fragile, carefully worded piece, brokered this time with Amara's steady presence in the next room rather than despite it, with none of the cold, isolated intensity that had once defined every decision he made. Not soft, don't mistake me, just different, like a man who finally has a reason to come home at the end of the day instead of just a place to sleep. "I do," Giovanni said, and did not elaborate, because some things he'd learned were worth keeping quiet and simply true rather than explained. Amara, for her part, found her own strange, careful footing in the world she'd chosen to step into. She did not become someone else to fit it. She kept her books, her early mornings, her habit of talking to gardens that hadn't yet learned to grow in New York soil. But she learned, slowly, the particular language of Giovanni's world, which silences meant danger and which meant simple exhaustion, which men in his orbit could be trusted, and which required the same careful, unblinking wariness she'd have shown a stranger washed up bleeding on her beach. She grieved, too, in the quiet moments no one saw, grieved the solitude she'd built so carefully at Windermere Point, grieved the particular safety of a life that asked nothing of her and therefore could take nothing away. But grief, she was learning, for the second time in her life, did not have to mean the absence of everything else. It could sit alongside love, alongside purpose, alongside the strange, terrifying gift of choosing to matter to someone again. "Do you regret it?" Giovanni asked her one night, months into their new life together, watching her from across the small kitchen of the water-facing apartment while she cooked, badly by her own admission, though he'd never once complained. "Choosing this, choosing me, Amara considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. "I regret that it cost people something," she said. "I regret that Dante's betrayal nearly cost you your life, and nearly cost me mine, and that men died at that shipyard who didn't have to. I don't regret choosing you." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, unhurried, certain. "You washed up on my beach half dead and lied to me for 3 weeks, and I still chose you. I think that tells you everything you need to know about how far gone I already was." They went back to the cottage the following spring, on the anniversary of the storm that had first thrown them together, and Amara stood on the beach where she'd found him, watching the same tide come in soft and unremarkable under a clear sky, and understood how completely her life had turned on that single wild night. "I used to think this place was where I went to disappear," she said, Giovanni's arms coming around her from behind, his chin resting against her hair. "Now I think it's where I finally stopped." "Stopped what?" "Running from wanting things." She turned in his arms to face him, the ocean wind pulling at her hair, the way it had the first night she'd dragged him up this exact stretch of sand. "I spent 2 years telling myself that wanting nothing was the only way to survive losing everything. You proved me wrong. Badly, inconveniently, at gunpoint, on my own beach, but wrong." He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the sound Sal had once told her he hadn't heard from his boss in a decade, and kissed her, slow and certain, with none of the desperate urgency of their first kiss and all of the deep, settled certainty of a love that had survived betrayal, distance, and the particular gravity of 2 damaged people choosing each other anyway. "I bought the property next door," Giovanni admitted against her mouth. "6 months ago. I've been meaning to tell you." Amara pulled back, startled. "You what?" "I couldn't stay away from this coastline, even when we weren't here," he said, something almost sheepish in his expression, an emotion she'd never once seen on the face of a man who ran an empire built on fear. "This is where I learned what it meant to be a person instead of a title. I wanted somewhere we could always come back to, somewhere that would always remember us, the way we actually are, underneath everything else." She kissed him again, laughing now herself, feeling something in her chest that had been closed tight for 2 years, finally fully open. "You're ridiculous," she said, "buying real estate as a love letter." "I'm thorough," he corrected, "and I learned a long time ago that the things worth keeping are worth fighting to keep close." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together the way he had that first evening on her porch steps, a lifetime and a war ago. "Marry me, Amara. Not because you need saving, and not because I need an heir or an alliance or any of the practical reasons men in my world usually marry. Marry me because I have spent my entire adult life building an empire out of things I could control. And you are the only thing I have ever wanted that I couldn't control at all. And I would rather spend the rest of my life uncertain of you than certain of anything else I've ever built." Amara looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had washed ashore, broken and nameless, who had lied to her and then loved her with a ferocity that had rearranged the entire architecture of her grief, who had walked into gunfire twice now for her sake, and never once asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. "Yes," she said. "God help me, yes." They married in October, On the beach at Windermere Point, with the tide going out gold and unhurried behind them, and a small gathering of people who mattered more than any guest list Giovanni's old life would have demanded. Sal, gruff and openly emotional in a way he'd deny for the rest of his life. Amara's sister, tentatively, cautiously, rebuilding a relationship Amara had let go dormant for 2 grief-heavy years. A handful of Giovanni's most trusted men, standing at a respectful distance, armed but unobtrusive, the quiet architecture of protection that had simply become part of the fabric of their lives now, accepted rather than resented. Amara wore her mother's old lace, altered to fit, and carried nothing but a small bouquet of the wild June roses that grew along the path where she'd once dragged a dying stranger up from the tide line. Giovanni wore no armour at all, no vest beneath his shirt, no weapon at his hip. The first time in over 20 years he had stood anywhere in the open without one. A vulnerability he'd chosen deliberately, telling Sal beforehand that if he couldn't trust the safety of this exact beach on this exact day, then nothing they'd fought for had meant anything at all. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said, and Giovanni did. Unhurried, certain, the whole weight of everything they'd survived folded into the quiet, ordinary miracle of 2 people choosing each other in the open air instead of behind locked doors. Later, after the small reception had wound down, after Sal had made an embarrassingly sincere toast and Amara's sister had cried through most of the ceremony, the 2 of them walked the beach alone in the fading light. Exactly the way they had that very first storm-lashed night. Except now, the sea was calm, and Giovanni was whole, and there was no blood in the water at all. "Do you ever think about it?" Amara asked. "That night, what would have happened if I hadn't looked out the window? If the tide had taken you somewhere else?" "Every day," Giovanni admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying alone, believing love was a luxury men like me didn't get to keep. And then I think about how the sea, of all things, cold, indifferent, nearly the thing that killed me, ended up being the very thing that carried me to you instead." He stopped walking, turning her gently to face him, the last of the light catching gold in her dark eyes. "I used to think I built my whole life out of power, because it was the only thing I could control. I understand now that the things worth having were never about control at all. You taught me that. You, and this beach, and a stranger's kindness I did nothing to deserve." "You deserved it," Amara said, quiet and certain. "Everyone deserves to be looked at like a person, at least once in their life, Giovanni. I'm just glad it was me who got to be the one looking." He kissed her again, there at the edge of the water, husband and wife now, a crime lord and a grieving teacher who had found, against every reasonable expectation the world could offer, that the wreckage of 2 broken lives could wash up together on the same shore and build something whole. Not despite the danger, not despite the darkness either of them carried, but because they had chosen, with open eyes, to carry it together instead of alone. Behind them the tide came in, soft and unhurried, erasing their footprints from the sand the way it always did, the way it had erased so much else over the years. But this time, for the first time since either of them could remember, neither one was afraid of what the water might take next. They had already survived the worst it had to offer. Everything after this was simply the rest of their lives, and they intended to spend every last inch of it exactly where they'd found each other, together, unguarded, and finally, fully home.